Hi, my name is Rishi Basu, and today I'm going to be going over some basic database stuff. Um, to get started, we should probably go over what a database is, and to do that, I'm going to try explaining this in the most simple fashion I can. A database is an organized collection of data used to retrieve and store information. But basically, it's kind of just a bunch of tables that holds information that are linked so you can easily find information later without going through duplicates. In my opinion, the most difficult part about finding out where the data needs to go um, is just kind of organizing it. But you can make this way easier by making an ERD or a entity relationship diagram to separate the information you need for each table and to show how the tables kind of link together. It shows you the overall design for the database. So what I have pulled up right now is an ERD diagram. It's the example we kind of use in class. It's students and it like has a bunch of little entities here. So I guess let's go over what an entity is. So an entity is anything, it's basically a person, a place, an object, an event, or a concept in the user environment about which the organization wishes to maintain data. So in this case, the entities would be student, undergraduate, graduate, phone number, course, and registration. You can see that labeled there. Um, but to make this a little bit easier, I'm going to go over a few key terms that I feel like you need to understand. So here I kept the words entity, attribute, primary key, relationship, and cardinality. Well, these are all very important terms, so let's go over them. An entity, again, is a person, place, an object, event, or a concept in the user environment about which the organization wishes to maintain data. Um, you have two things, an entity type, which is a collection of entities that share common properties or characteristics. Uh, an example of this would be like a staff in a company, staff. You could have many people that are staff, and they could share many common properties, or an entity instance. An entity instance is a little bit different. It's a single occurrence of an entity type. A good example of this would be a single student is an instance of the entity student. So, uh, just for the sake of the example that we're doing. So a student is a single occurrence of the entity. Um, Now let's go over strong versus weak entities. Um, A strong entity exists independently of other types of entities, and it has its own unique identifier. I'd like to consider use the example, a parent is a strong entity, and a weak entity is dependent on the strong entity and cannot exist on its own, kind of like a child. Uh, it does not have a unique identifier, only a partial identifier, and the entity box and partial identifier have double lines. So as I said, boxes, when they have two lines around a rectangle, uh, you can often understand that it's dependent. To make more sense of this, I'm going to drag in a little picture here. It's right here, and you can see here that dependent is double boxed. And that's because it's just a representation on the ER diagram uh, of what a dependent variable is. So yeah, dependence of, you can see, is also double boxed in a little triangle in a diamond. So that's the best way of essentially understanding that concept on an ER diagram. Now, let's move on to attributes. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint slide now. An attribute is properties or characteristics of an entity or relationship type. Uh, classifications of attributes, required versus optional attributes, simple versus composite attributes, single valued versus multi-valued attributes, stored versus derived attributes, and identifier attributes. Today we're basically going to be going over required attributes, optional attributes, composite attributes, multi-valued attributes, and derived attributes. So here we can see that our attributes are first name, last name, address, city, state, zip, email. And in undergraduate, you can see high school, graduated from, high school GPA. These are basically descriptors of the entities, you know. So required versus optional attributes. Required must have a value for every entity or relationship instance with which it is associated. Optional may not have a value for every entity or relationship instance with when it's associated. And so here you can see if it's optional or required. Student ID required, blah, 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 blah. But major is optional, you know. Example instances, MIS. And that is basically a pretty easy explanation of optional attributes versus required. You can see how sometimes an attribute is not needed, and in which case it would be optional. Next, let's talk about composite attributes and component attributes. Well, a composite attribute is an attribute that has a meaningful component part. So in this example, you can see that employee address under employee is a composite attribute. Component attributes would be the little details, so the street address, the city, the state, the postal code, you know. Um, that's pretty simple stuff. Let's move on to multi-valued and derived attributes. Um Multi-valued may take on more than one value for a given entity or relationship instance. Um, i.e., in this situation, we see skill being a huge factor in that. Derived values can be calculated from related attributes not physically stored in the database. So in this case, it would be years employed. You can calculate the years employed, but skills is obviously multi-valued. Yeah, and that's pretty simple explanation of attributes. Attributes is a pretty easy concept. They're descriptors, and just kind of remembering what these things do and is kind of just the tough part. So now let's get into relationships. Relationship instance is a link between entities. It corresponds with the primary key, foreign key equivalences, and related tables. The hardest part about this is kind of understanding what a unary relationship is, a binary relationship, and a ternary relationship. I'm not sure if I said that right, but basically what it means is there's a lot more things involved. I'm going to be pulling up a table for you guys so you can see what it looks like. First of all, let's look at the unary relationship. So the way I like to think about it is a unary relationship is between entities in a single entity type. Uh, a good example I like to use is the relationship like friendship between entities within the entity type person. You don't really get to see that here, but if so you can see that employee manages himself and is managed by things. This is a unary relationship. Um, the second part here is a binary relationship. The customer received the invoice. The invoice was sent to the customer, and so forth and so on. You can see that entity is a binary relationship because the two entity types are involved in the relationship type. Whereas in the first one, it's only just one entity kind of going around, you know what I'm saying? Um, so the third part is a little bit more complicated because uh, you can kind of see that in a ternary relationship. You can see in this last one right here, this is a ternary relationship, and it has three things involved now, you know? So you have a middleman too, which is performs, but uh, operator, operation, and part are a three-way relationship. And so um, because there are three things involved, it's called a ternary relationship. So to close off relationships, we can understand that basically a unary relationship is the first degree. Uh, it only has one thing to deal with, you know, as seen. Binary relationship has two entities or two things to deal with, and a ternary relationship uh, is something with three, you know. So it's one entity is a unary, two entities of two different types is a binary, and ternary has three. Now, so let's go over cardinality of relationships. So we could see that now that you understand unary, binary, and ternary relationships, we need to understand cardinality. So what many people use is, and what we were taught in class, is the crow's foot mentality. So this is it. Um, from zero to many, from one to many, from one to one, and from zero to one. One to one is each entity in the relationship will exactly have one um, basically matchable entity. One to many is an entity on one side of the relationship can have many related entities, but an entity on the other side will have a maximum of one related entity. Many to many is entities on both sides of the relationship can have many related entities on the other side. And these are the symbols. So basically, you can see 0 to 1, 1 to 1, 1 to many. And basically, many to many would be these crow's feet on both sides. So that would be a many to many relationship. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's pretty straightforward. So as long as you remember these things, 0 to many, 1 to many, 1 to 1, 0 to 1, and then remember that many to many is crow's foot, you should be fine on cardinality of relationships. Uh, there's cardinality constraints. These are the number of instances that one entity can or must have be associated with the instance of another entity. Minimum cardinality, if zero, then optional. If one or more, then mandatory, and maximum cardinality. These are represented a lot by these crow's feet. You can see the 0 to many represented there too. Uh, I think these are kind of very important things. So when you have two lines, the one-to-one thing you see in here, and one line before the many, then you have a mandatory amount. And here, I'll just pull up another thing. So this is the difference between optional and mandatory. This is actually Professor G's slide. But um, yeah, so there's a mandatory line right here. You can see that. And then this circle here represents optional. And it's pretty straightforward. So here actually he has the stuff, the cardinalities. Mandatory one, mandatory many, optional one, optional many. Um, and that also means 0 to many. So yeah, that's a very good example. The last thing I'm going to go over is associative entities and just kind of the rules because we're almost running out of time. I'm going to be using Professor Chi's slide again, but as I said, I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to be pulling this slide again. Uh, this is an associative entity. So certificate in this situation is, you can see that it's basically the middleman between course and employee. And it's a pretty simple thing, you know? So you have employee course, certificate and course, and certificate in this case is the associative entity. It's a relationship with an attribute, but it's also considered to be an entity in its own right. All right, guys, that was my project, and I hope you liked my tutorial. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.